Hello, thank you for watching. I'm Heidi Cloutier, one of the trainers with the Northeast Positive Behavior Interventions and Supports Network. Today we'll be discussing how to develop a continuum for responding to concerning behavior. The content for this module was developed by the Northeast Positive Behavior Interventions and Supports Network. This is part 1 of 3. Here we'll explore the importance of behavioral definitions and the difference between minors or staff managed behaviors and majors, which are office or behavior support team managed behaviors. Module 2 will introduce the use of a flowchart to communicate procedures to staff, and part 3 will look at the behavior referral process and how to ensure consistent documentation and responses to inappropriate behavior. We're focusing on getting started step number 7, establishing a continuum for correcting behavior errors. With your team, we'll ask you to develop measurable, objective definitions for inappropriate behavior. We'll ask you to differentiate between major and minor behaviors, and then develop a discipline ladder or flowchart and submit these documents to Canvas for feedback from your trainers. Make sure you work with your team to determine how you'll share this information with staff, students, and stakeholders. So as we think about establishing a continuum for addressing behavior errors, we know that proactive and instructive responses to concerning behavior are more likely to lead to improved student outcomes than exclusionary practices, such as office referrals or suspensions. It's therefore important to develop a continuum for addressing behaviors that staff buy into so we can ensure consistent and equitable approaches are used across our school community. We also want to remember that this is built upon a classroom culture where students feel comfortable making mistakes in the name of learning, and that their social emotional behavior and academic progress are celebrated. So why should we develop a continuum of consequences? Think for a moment about the wide range of concerning behaviors you see within your school. Do you think every behavior deserves the same response? What if the behavior occurs many times rather than just once? We want to make sure that the severity and intensity of the behavior matches the consequences or response. In the hierarchy of consequences, the least severe consequences should match the behaviors that are deemed least severe. The most severe consequences should be reserved for the most severe rule violations. Let's walk through a couple of examples and non-examples. So a student who's tardy to more than, say, 3 classes may need to spend a free period mapping out a more efficient route through the school or organizing their locker so that they're on time to class in the future. A non-example of matching the severity of a consequence to the behavior is that a student who's tardy to class might get suspended for 3 days. We don't want all students to serve in-school suspensions for every rule violation, regardless of the severity. The student who copies on a test, which is a more severe violation, should not receive the same consequence as a student who forgot their homework, a less severe violation. Having consistency in responses is an important component of establishing a positive, predictable, and safe school environment. A well-articulated system ensures fairness and that all staff have the tools they need to make quick, effective, and consistent decisions about how to address concerning behaviors. This is easier said than done, but it can be done. So let's take a look at how to do that. We start by looking at the function of behavior. This is why the student engages in the behavior, what it is that he or she gets or avoids from engaging in that behavior. So for the example we used with the student who's tardy to class, it might be that they are trying to get time with their peers or to get out of a class that they're not prepared for. A non-example is if a student tries to avoid a task by disrupting the teacher and then they get sent to the office or to a timeout, then the behavior has served its function, the task has been avoided, and the student will see no need to change their behavior. We also want to be sure that our responses align with our school-wide expectations by explicitly teaching the clearly defined rules and acknowledging and reinforcing the appropriate behavior. This should exist as one component of a larger system of behavior change for the students and ensure we have a strong system of supports, that we're teaching the expectations, acknowledging those expectations before reinforcing and putting consequences in place for students if they're not having expected behavior. It's essential to help staff develop a continuum of strategies to discourage behavior errors and to ensure that we're using any missteps as opportunities to teach or reteach the more appropriate behaviors. I encourage teams to think about how to push in prompts, reminders, and model the use of instructional responses such as redirecting, reteaching, conferencing with the student, and when necessary, the student's caregiver. Responses to social errors should be respectful and reduce the probability of escalating behavior. There's ample research that demonstrates that punishment without a positive, proactive, and instructional approach results in increased aggression, vandalism, truancy, and dropouts. Much like we do with academic errors, staff should view social and behavioral errors as opportunities to correct and teach the alternatives to the desirable behavior, and use instructional responses such as redirecting, reteaching, and conferencing as necessary. If we want to help young people develop skills to engage in more pro-social behavior, we need to treat behavioral errors like academic errors. When we're teaching math and a student struggles to grasp that 2 + 2 is 4, we look at changing our instructional strategies so they can develop skills to learn to add. We need to recognize that error corrections have the goal of teaching better behavior. So when a student talks over another student or uses bad language, we want to teach the more desirable or situationally appropriate behavior. Remember that responses to social errors should be respectful and reduce the probability of escalating behavior. There are 3 important components of organizing building and district responses to addressing behavior. We need to start by having clearly defined behavioral definitions. Your team will want to come to consensus on these behavioral definitions and have a good communication plan to share strategies with other stakeholders. Explicit definitions of wanted and unwanted behavior provides clarity to both the student and staff and is a critical component of identifying clear procedures for staff to respond to inappropriate behavior objectively. Frequent communication and reviewing the data will help with this step. Then we need to develop a flow chart so everyone knows the difference between staff versus office managed behavior. This is discussed more in part 2 of this series. Your team should work with staff across the school to develop categories for behavior that include staff managed, office managed, and situationally appropriate behaviors to develop your behavior flow chart. It's important for teams to actively seek consensus among staff with responses to problem behavior by revisiting and practicing those procedures at least annually or as your data indicates a need. The last piece, which we'll focus on in part 3 of this series, entails developing a behavior referral form that will help ensure a consistent process for gathering data and monitoring behaviors. We encourage teams to review existing discipline policies to ensure that inclusionary practices are used whenever possible, and that exclusionary practices are used with discretion and for safety purposes only, and always with an instructional component with a focus on restoring relationships. Again, don't forget to seek feedback from other stakeholder groups, such as students and caregivers as well, to align disciplinary procedures with community expectations. In most schools, if I were to ask 20 different staff to define disrespectful behavior, I would probably get 20 different responses. To address this, it's best to start by developing clarity around what is considered a major behavior that needs to be addressed by administration or a behavior support team versus a minor behavior that should be addressed by staff. Minors are low-intensity behaviors that happen more frequently. Minor behaviors include students talking while other students are talking, or 2 students arguing over whose turn it is to use the swing. While majors are more serious behaviors that tend to occur less frequently, such as harassment or physical aggression. Part of the process will be having conversations amongst your staff so everyone is on the same page. So many administrators express concerns about the fact that some staff have different levels of tolerance, as well as a range of skills for managing student behavior. Having consistency benefits everyone in your school community. So how do we do that? Let's take a look. Consistency starts with clear definitions of what constitutes concerning behavior in the first place. That's why it's really important to clarify definitions, especially around more subjective behaviors such as disrespect, defiance, and disruption. It's also critical for students to experience consistent expectations as they move from setting to setting throughout the school day. So let's look at some examples of how schools have done that. Charting these behaviors out using a tool like the pie chart, which is located on page 38 of the Cultural Responsive Field Guide, helps keep administration, staff, students, and families on the same page. Think of a long-term substitute or brand new teacher in your building. How would they know what behavior they should handle themselves or when they should request assistance? This chart can be used with your school PBIS team, whole staff, at the classroom level, or in partnership with the larger community, including caregivers. The chart is called a pie chart because of the dark bars separating the columns and headings look like the Greek symbol pi. It articulates the difference between behavior that's wrong and classroom managed, wrong and office managed, and behavior that's acceptable in some situations but is situationally inappropriate for the current setting. Behaviors that are wrong are addressed through the school's process for addressing behavior concerns. Behaviors that are culturally inappropriate are retaught in an effort to help the student differentiate between home and school behavior expectations. It clarifies the behaviors that are not okay for one setting, but might be acceptable in another setting. For example, a student might come from a background where the conversation style of overlap or contributing to a conversation before the first speaker is done talking is practiced. Instead of punishing the student for talking out, staff can use this tool to teach when and where overlap is desired in schools. Staff managed or minor behaviors are handled by the teacher with no administrative action needed. Your school may still decide to document these behaviors or track trends and identify areas for school improvements. Office managed or major behaviors are more serious behaviors that are handled by an administrator or other support team in the school and often will include some administrative action. So let's practice. Bringing a weapon to school would be a serious offense and be classified as a major or office managed behavior. Not having the appropriate materials or missing materials would be a minor or staff managed behavior. Checking work with peers is a situationally inappropriate behavior where the student needs to be taught when it's okay to check work with others and when it's not. Harassment is never okay, and that's going to be an office managed behavior. Touching peers is situationally inappropriate. There are times when it's okay to touch a peer and others when it's not okay. So we need to take that as a teaching moment. Refusal to complete an assignment is a staff managed behavior. And dress code violations are usually also going to be handled by staff in the classroom. Be sure to talk with staff in your school to come to consensus on these behavior definitions. Many schools use the School-Wide Information System, or SWIS, to collect and analyze behavior data. They offer clear definitions of behaviors commonly seen in a school. Your school may choose to use these definitions or develop their own definitions. As long as everyone has an opportunity to learn about the definitions, you can make it match the context of your school. Your behavioral definitions should include contextually appropriate labels and names, definitions that represent a continuum of severity from minor to major, and may touch on illegal behavior as well. Definitions should be comprehensive in scope across your school and in measurable terms. And we want to make sure that our definitions are mutually exclusive so that there's minimal overlap or confusion about what constitutes one behavior to the next. Plan with your team how you'll develop measurable, observable definitions for problem behavior. Make sure to differentiate between major, minors, and situationally inappropriate behaviors. Think about how you'll get your team to come to consensus on behavioral definitions for concerning behavior. Will you create subcommittees, facilitate a discussion at a staff meeting, survey staff, or use some other method? What additional stakeholders should be included in this discussion, and how can this happen? How can you include students, family members, the school board, and the larger community? Document action items on your action plan. Once you've drafted your behavioral definitions, upload these to Canvas for feedback from your PBIS trainer. Thanks for joining me to explore Getting Started Step Number 7, Part 1 of a series of addressing behavior errors. In Part 1, we explored developing a continuum for correcting behavior errors, teaching situationally appropriate behavior, and coming to consensus on behavior definitions so that we can ensure consistent and equitable approaches are used across our school community. To summarize, your team tasks include developing measurable, objective definitions for problem behavior, differentiating between majors and minors, and working with your team to determine how you'll share this information with staff, students, and caregivers. Be sure to upload these documents to Canvas for feedback from. If you have any questions or would like additional support, please reach out to your Academy trainers, and be sure to check out Part 2 on developing a flowchart and Part 3 to learn how to ensure consistent documentation and tracking of behaviors by developing an effective behavior referral form. Thanks so much. Have a great day.